everyone, and welcome to Shannon Q. I am Shannon Q, as you may or may not know if you are here today, and I am very, very excited about having this discussion today with Peter. We are going to have a conversation about platforming, cancel culture, and I don't even think that we're going to be able to touch on all of the things that I want to touch on. So it's going to be a good conversation, I think. I've been watching Peter essentially engage in this topic all day. Just coincidentally, that's kind of the way things worked out. So I'm very, very much excited. I've got a lot running through my head. But before we get going, Peter, I'd just like you to have an opportunity to tell everybody, in case they don't know who you are, and where they can find you.
Well, I appreciate that. First, thank you very much for having me on.
Oh, I'm excited.
My name is Peter Coffin. I'm a YouTube video essayist. My series is called Very Important Documentaries. It's findable on youtube.com/Peter Coffin. I'm also a podcaster. Low Society is the name of my podcast, if you're interested in that. I wrote a book called Custom Reality and You. It all generally coalesces around dealing with ideology, and I think that ultimately that's sort of what has led me here. I'm sure we'll get further into more specifics on that, but as far as cancel culture goes, it's something that has maybe not always been called this, but has always been something that's affected my life for like the last decade. And yeah, it's an important thing to me because it doesn't necessarily ground itself in a huge amount of truth. It can certainly, like when we've seen Harvey Weinstein, that event that was provable, that was ended up in a actual like jail sentence, et cetera. But yeah, it's an interesting topic. It's something I care a lot about, and I do appreciate you having me on to talk about it.
Yeah, I really enjoyed listening to your video today. I actually listened through to it twice because I think that there was a lot in there to kind of absorb. I've linked that video in the description, along with another video, the video you did on Milo Yiannopoulos and deplatforming.
Oh.
So yeah, so both of those are linked down there, so people should be able to find the channel through those videos that are relevant to the conversation that we're having today. So just to give a little background, I briefly told Peter before we went in, and I'm going to tell you guys now why I invited Peter on today, is because Peter was going to speak to Milo at the Better Discourse. Is that what it was called in Milwaukee?
It's called Better Discourse in Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
Right. Yeah. And then you weren't going to speak to him anymore. And we'll get into why and what happened there. And I saw your video on it, and it made me think a lot about who we really were deplatforming, because in that instance, it seemed as though you were the one ultimately who was being deplatformed, because Milo was still going to be there and was still going to have somebody engaging. So it made me think a lot about when we engage in this sort of behavior to influence the influencers, to try to put social pressure on people like you or people like me or anybody who's engaging in the public dialectic. What are we really doing when we tell them we don't want them to talk to this person, when we put pressure on them? You know, you receive death threats. Somebody told you that they wanted you to get terminal cancer. So
yes.
I thought that would be maybe a good jumping off point, because I thought that was an interesting perspective that I hadn't thought of, that really you were the one in that instance who was being kind of deplatformed.
I would agree with you, because ultimately I had access to a platform and then I did not anymore.
Right.
And it wasn't necessarily because, I mean, ultimately, publicly, I did put forward that like it was a choice I had made, and I let the conference know. Ultimately I was the one that had to do it. Mm-hmm. However, it came from pressure being exerted on. I'm not going to get entirely specific on how deeply personal the pressure got, but it did get deeply personal. It did actually threaten me, materially speaking. And so ultimately it did end in me being deplatformed, because it wasn't necessarily that I wanted to. Like it was technically, from probably a legal perspective, my choice to do it. But it was coerced by sort of collectivization of power, people participating in a campaign where ultimately they rallied a lot of people to be angry at me for talking to Milo Yiannopoulos, for quote unquote giving him a platform, which I think we can talk about platforming for a moment as to what it actually means. But in this answer, I would more or less say, like, yeah, I think that I was ultimately coerced out of a platform, which it's like, what else can we call that if not deplatforming?
Right. And this is where I come to the struggle. And I think when I initially approached you, this is one of the things that I mentioned to you is that I come up against not wanting these people that I think have reprehensible ideas to get more attention. And
Mm-hmm.
if we, and what we need to do to make sure that that happens, and
Mm-hmm.
what is an effective strategy in order to enact that. Because in this instance, Milo was still there. So I would argue that potentially telling you, putting pressure on you to not go there wasn't necessarily an effective strategy. And I was attempting to figure
Yeah.
out kind of like the mental calculus that goes into that, like this social math. And one of the things that I came to was maybe people perceived that you had, you know, a broader spectrum of societal influence, at least
Mm-hmm.
at this point, as compared to Milo. So you being next to Milo gave him the potential for more attention, whereas somebody else that may not have been the case. I'm not sure. What do you think about that? Because I've been trying to
I
mull it
think
over.
that I think that that's probably like at the core, that's probably actual mechanical concern that people had.
Okay.
Um, I'm not necessarily certain. Okay, let me rephrase that. That is, I think, the core mechanical concern people acting in good faith had.
Okay.
I also think there is some aspect of bad faith. Like, I think probably the most violent stuff came from people who really don't like Peter Coffin. And again, you said there was potential for him to get attention out of this. There's also potential for me to get attention out of
Right.
this on account I'm engaging somewhere where honestly I don't have clout. And if I
Oh yeah,
go
your
in
audience
there,
wasn't the audience that was
yeah,
going to be
my
in
audience is not the better
better
discourse
discourse
audience
audience.
at all.
Mine either.
So
Yeah.
I'm going in somewhere where I have the potential actually to, say some things to people who haven't heard them or haven't heard them from somebody who is actually ideologically promoting them.
Mm-hmm.
In a lot of cases, they maybe have heard a lot of Marxist ideas, however, very simplified, put forward in a manner that is derogatory, et cetera, that type of thing. And I think that to some respect, like the people who are acting in bad faith may have recognized that this would have helped me, because it's certainly like they didn't get angry when Destiny went and did the exact same thing that I was going to do, except for he brought a much more, I would say, status quo oriented perspective to push back against Milo Yiannopoulos, whereas I had a very I would say material conditions, Marxism, political economy based spiel that I had intended to go in with. So I'm sorry, I've gotten away from the original
No,
question.
you're okay because it actually goes into the point because you brought up Destiny, and that's another thing. Like there was a juxtaposition because he didn't really get pushback. Do you think that that's because there's a difference in the type of audience that you cultivate? Like you maybe cultivate an audience that's maybe skews more empathetic and skews more left leaning and skews more looking for societal protection for marginalized groups. So they would be more inclined to not want to see you interact with Milo or give him attention or perceive you as giving him attention, whereas Destiny's core audience maybe is a little bit more, center to the left or center to the
Yeah.
right, and is less inclined to really care who he's talking to because they just kind of want to see him argue, and that's the commodity that he offers.
I think that that's probably some people's perspective. Again, the people who are maybe acting in good faith in this situation.
I keep
And
assuming that.
yeah,
Silly Shannon.
the thing is I have a history with online folks.
Okay.
And that history involves a lot of claims that have been made against me falsely.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say that colors a lot of people's opinion on what they want done from me, maybe perhaps even more so than whether or not they want quote unquote protection for marginalized groups. I think that most leftists ultimately do think that, but I also think that there's an element of bad faith, and I think that the bad faith people are a little bit better at rallying people than the good faith people, because the good faith people, there were people who reached out to me and expressed concerns. It was kind of drowned out by the noise of the more virulent stuff that was going on. But it's not as if people didn't have legitimate concerns. I think that, I've done a lot more streaming lately and sort of brought the strategy that I would have used on him more so to those debates. And I've had a lot of people say, maybe it wasn't such a good idea to get you to not do this. Maybe Destiny did concede a little bit too much ground to him. Maybe, like, I've had people say stuff like that to me. So it's not as if there aren't good faith people. And I think that is ultimately their concern, like you said. But there is also a large element of, I think, bad faith as well. And unfortunately, I have to keep underlining that, just because, there are going to be people that are watching this that do want me to say something that they can, use somewhere in a bad way. And that's something that follows me around. And I unfortunately have to show people what that's like, because it's not necessarily something that happens to all people.
Right.
And that's ultimately, like, again, what this whole cancel culture thing is about. I think that a lot of people see it and they think, well, this is just somebody complaining about something that they did, and, they're being held accountable for, or whatever.
Yeah, where you're being held accountable is what people...
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that there's a lot more ancillary information that a lot of people don't take into account when they're actually looking at one of these events. There's oftentimes some form of following, whether it be a hate following, or just people who are casually, like, checking in to see if this person did something that's outrageous. I know there's people that follow people on Twitter and make lists of people to check to see if they've said something that can be taken out of context. It's insane. But it's also the product of a lot of incentives, and that's the sort of stuff that I find most interesting about the subject. It looks like mob justice, but it's, in my opinion, an expression of institutional power.
Okay, that's a good segue, because getting away from the Milo thing, and as it specifically pertains to you, because I'm actually interested mostly in your thoughts in general on the concept, like the social phenomena that is, deplatforming and cancel culture as we perceive it. And I have about 1 billion thoughts, and I was interested in a lot of the things that you said today in the video. And like I said, it's linked in the description so that people, because I think I'm probably going to reference it a fair bit, and you may as well. So people should probably go check it out so that they can contextualize what we're discussing. But you said a couple of really interesting things, and one of them, and I can't remember exactly which one it is, I think it was about commodification, and it made me think a great deal about, because I look at it kind of from a different perspective, and I mentioned this to you prior, that I see it more as like a sociocultural and psychological phenomena of people wanting to exercise what little degree of power they perceive themselves as having. So within the system that we have built now, if you're not very rich or very influential, you have very little power. So the only way to really cultivate power as somebody who's marginalized, or as somebody who cares about the marginalized and cares about societal influence, is to collectivize, is to try to gather as a group in order to have that collective power, because individually you don't. So I think a lot of people do that with, like you said, honest intentions.
Yes.
But then it becomes commodified, because people like you and like me build narratives around it so that they can put out a video, and they embolden those people in order to escalate the situation. Because if they escalate the situation, then they can make more videos, and they can do more exposed videos. And,
absolutely.
And they can catch you in something. So, and it just becomes this perpetuating cycle where the original of intent, which was to hold somebody accountable and maybe have a conversation about how they could think better, or how they could act better, or how they could perceive things differently, suddenly becomes an exercise in vilification and othering, so that the people who are profiting off of it can continue to influence culture towards that end. I don't know what you think about that.
No, that's a fantastic way of putting it, I think, because I mean it's not just like people like yourself and myself where we're making a video about cancel culture at this very moment.
Right. Yeah.
It's also that there is an incentive to talk about it. I'm on your platform right now, but that's really a child platform of a parent platform, the parent platform being YouTube.
Right.
YouTube benefits from all of the talk on any controversial thing that can be extended beyond, an initial hey, I made a 15-minute video, it got responded to, and that's that.
Mm-hmm.
If it's a societal narrative that can be tapped into and continued, so to speak, it's something that these platforms sort of, whether they outwardly create an incentive or not, the incentive on YouTube is to talk about something that's culturally relevant, or relevant in some other way. I would generally say culturally relevant. But so we end up with a situation where I think, you have a lot of people who don't actually look at this from the perspective of, all right, how is this, culturally a phenomenon? How is this socially a phenomenon? What is the psychology of this? Is there an element of commodities? Like, you have people who are just sort of looking at it from the perspective of, is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? Is this a thing I like? Is this a thing I dislike?
Right.
And that ends up, maybe being a genuine opinion for all we know, but it also, since we're acting in what is sort of, I like to say, the marketplace of ideas where attention is currency, we're operating in a manner where even if you have a genuine opinion, you have to find a way to put it that is going to raise some sort of a following. It's going to mobilize people in some way. So, that incentive, I think that's the incentive, more or less, to commodify. And when we're doing the commodifying, we're doing the work for the parent platform, as opposed to, we benefit from it, but ultimately the profit, the actual company that is profiting from it is YouTube. Like, you and I make money off of the cancel culture video we made. They make money off of every cancel culture video and also all the other videos. If they are kept, if a viewer is kept on the platform, that's important. And this has become such a cultural narrative, it's something that's more likely to keep people on the platform, and therefore YouTube likes it. They might prioritize a keyword like cancel culture or something like that, and it ends up, it tends
or
to be
the name of a
algorithmic.
person who currently is
Yes,
in the midst of
well,
being canceled.
look at all the Shane Dawson videos. Look at all the James Charles videos.
Yes, exactly.
That's been a really heavy emphasis on YouTube, and you could call it like drama, but it's not necessarily drama, because there is kind of a marketing campaign that is raised against all of these people as these videos go on. It's in a lot of ways like when somebody's getting some sort of, they're trying to petition a company to do something, because what we're talking about here is petitioning relevant institutional power to perform an action ultimately. And that involves branding the subject so that people agree that this action should have to happen. It involves articulating what action they want to have happen. And then, of course, pushing that onto whatever relevant institutional power in a manner that they'll actually respond to it, i.e. in a manner that somehow affects their bottom line.
Right. So I agree with you on that point, and this is where I become conflicted, because you can exist within, and I think you're probably going to anticipate what I'm going to say, because you can exist within that and see it as being bad, because they're essentially incentivizing, polarization and conflict.
Yes.
And perpetuating that in order to profit.
Yes.
But by the same token, we already have to exist within that paradigm. And if you can operate within the system to do things like remove an Alex Jones or remove like the neo-Nazis, like if you Stefan Molyneux, like if you can operate within that system and put enough pressure on that existing system to remove them, many people would see that as, working within the system to a benefit. And that's why this type of thing, like, this canceling, this deplatforming, is ultimately can have dividends that are beneficial.
I would say that to some extent, yes, it can be beneficial. But on another extent, we also have to think about the fact that an Alex Jones or a Milo Yiannopoulos does have like actual like hard capital. They have money, they have an institution that gives them money.
Right.
Alex Jones has built an institution on his own outside of everything. He's basically independent. He does sell subscriptions just fine since he's left been
And
forced
Stefan
off
Molyneux got
YouTube.
$400,000 in donations the day
Exactly.
he was
That
deplatformed.
was exactly what I was going to get at next.
Yeah.
Because it can be used as long as there is a platform that they can express through, then it doesn't really matter if they, especially if they've already got a platform or they have institutional power that's willing to push them in some way. And that's ultimately like my argument to some extent against the idea of deplatforming these people, because it often valorizes their followings. It often sort of pushes whatever relevant institutional power supports them into further supporting
Makes them a public martyr for free speech.
Yes, exactly. Like you have that censored.tv network that sprung up that has Milo Yiannopoulos on it. It has Gavin McInnes on it. It has Soph, that 14-year-old girl that got canceled last year for saying alt-right stuff. It's something that's funded by people with money. It's not something that, you know, organically, like they got together and they were like, oh man, we got all got censored. Why don't we make a network about that? Like they didn't do that. Some think tank guy and some venture capitalist got together and said, you know what, let's get all these canceled figures together and put them under one roof and sell a subscription to it. And that's the thing is, there is sort of a subversive knowledge idea associated with it as well, to where like, why did they cancel this person? And I don't necessarily, because a lot of the time, again, these are the people that control the narratives. These people with lots of money, they own like stakes in media companies and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
They are actually able to disseminate the narrative that they are martyrs. They're able to push that out there to at least an extent where enough people accept it that it becomes an argument. And once it becomes an argument, then that's it. It just becomes a partisan thing. Talking about, you know, how meaning gets taken out of terms, that's, you know, where a lot of that comes. Once it just simply becomes an argument, the argument boils itself down gradually into a much more simplistic argument that is along the lines of partisanship, and that's where we are with this, I think, ultimately.
What about the argument that, and like I said, I've been thinking about this a lot, and the argument that it's the difference between giving somebody, you know, a sound system in the middle of a stadium in a public square in a large city, as opposed to them now, like that being like YouTube and Twitter and Facebook, and now they're kind of relegated to, you know, performing in they're not doing stadium tours anymore. Now they're, you know, in shady bars that only like 5 to 10 people are coming to see them. So you're limiting the power of their influence by removing them from having this massive megaphone that everybody else has access to.
I think that that's a good point. But I also think that part of it is that like there's enough demand still that if they were allowed in the stadium, there would be people who would buy the tickets. And ultimately that means instead of selling out a stadium show, or maybe that, let me rephrase that. That means instead of perhaps selling some of the seats in a stadium, they sell all of the seats in the tiny venue, and they can say we've sold out every show that we've done. And it's a matter of like creating propaganda around. These people are very able to spin that type of stuff. That's their job. I would even assert it's often to lie.
Right. Right. And they don't care, I suppose, because to them, they're not really being canceled.
No, I mean,
because they're still financially benefiting from.
Yes. If you recall, Milo Yiannopoulos was claiming to be broke for a while, and everybody just took him at his word over that. I was just very confused over that. That was maybe a year ago. Because
he never lies. That's why.
Yeah, exactly. I was very confused by like, people are like, well, he was desolate. He had no money. He was complaining about not having money. Like, you do understand this guy is a professional liar and likes to take money from people, right? That's the thing that he's doing there. He's lying so that people will give him money. Like whether he had money or not is irrelevant. This guy, you know, he makes money from doing exactly that, making controversy.
Yeah. So from their perspective, I guess that they're not really cancelable because like they'll still find somebody to essentially be a patron of them and support them and find a way to develop a platform as they are for them to continue.
Given one by some form of I think that that's really the key. A lot of the sort of people that everybody's really trying to like deplatform on the right are people that the Mercers have pushed out into the public consciousness, or the Koch brothers, or what have you.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that understanding that if you get them removed from YouTube, they aren't gone. I think that that's something that people need to start understanding more so.
That like evokes a bit of a helpless feeling in me, though, because it makes me feel like, well,
No,
yes,
I sympathize
you have to
with
recognize
that.
that, though, right? Because essentially that's saying you may as well do nothing, because even if you get them removed from these large public platforms where, arguably they've got more influence than they may have if they go to their insular platforms.
Sure.
Although I'm sure that eventually they may cultivate an audience
Out,
there, but they don't have a
outreach,
ready-made one.
outreach is easier on the big ones.
Yes, exactly. It's easier to recruit new people to buy into
exactly.
your ideology when you have, kind of a tabula rasa, like ubiquitous mass audience across the world than if you go to this insular platform. But if the argument is that, getting them down to the insular platforms doesn't take away any institutional power because they're still being propagated, then it makes me feel as though, what do you do? What do you do?
Unfortunately, I think the thing that we really need to start doing, and this is a very simplistic idea, but we really, really need to start spending more time not dunking on individual people, and instead,
that's a good point. I was going to get there.
Completely engaging, just fully engaging with arguments and actually attempting, like, we might have to highlight that, yes, this person made this argument.
Cheers. Yeah.
It's a lot better if we spend our time focusing on the overall argument and maybe even attempting to find more examples than simply like, Milo Yiannopoulos said this thing and that's wrong. Instead, this thing is wrong. Milo Yiannopoulos has said it, and look at all of these other people who have said it. There's a pattern here that is emerging. Perhaps this thing is systemic. Perhaps we can explore it from that perspective, yada, yada, yada. I think that ultimately it's a different approach we have to take. There's obviously always going to be, people's genuine concerns and genuine actions are commodified basically anytime they're interfacing with one of these platforms. So it's not exactly something we can completely avoid. But if we are clear with our arguments, we can at least get somewhere with people and perhaps, in some ways change at least the discourse and perhaps the actions.
Yeah. And I think that's a great idea. But I mean, it's one of the things that I advocate for. It's even why I started this channel, is because I think that there's not enough real good constructive dialogue taking place around complex issues. People are really, really, really busy trying to, as you would say, maybe like garner some social currency by, owning each other. And,
Absolutely.
because we've managed as a society and as a culture to turn social interactions into a form of entertainment and then sensationalize it to a degree that we have to essentially be character actors, even acting as ourselves in these forums.
No, you are 100% correct. You're referring to like what I would refer to at if we were talking about Guy Debord, the spectacle. What we're talking about here is the image of ourselves versus the actual internal self.
Yeah.
The image is the thing that people get. It's the thing that becomes commodified. It's the thing that ultimately is kind of the exchange that you're making with other people. And that ends up sort of making us disconnect from our public personas. And I'm not saying specifically content creators is the same thing. I think that happens
Humans
on
in general.
Facebook, for instance. Yeah. Yep. Just it ends up disconnecting us. We end up talking about, things that we have as opposed to things that we are. We end up talking about, opinions from a very
for the first time in history, huge aspects of ourselves are a part of a public persona.
Exactly.
So and we are not made for all of us being, to a certain degree, celebrities in amongst our own following and having to consistently perform because we're always subject to that form of judgment. So I think that equates to us not always interacting in a genuine way. We're interacting in a way so that the other people who are seeing that interaction will support that interaction because we fear reprisal.
Absolutely.
If we don't say the right things.
That's the key right there. There is an element of coercion in it that I think that people are often failing to. Yes, exactly. I think that there's an element of coercion, sort of social pressure that's inherent in these things because we're all a sort of limited purpose public figure. that is being scrutinized in the same mode that people have sort of been accustomed to with celebrities, because they look at everybody kind of like, did you see what blankety blank said? Did you see what blankety blank did? There's that same tabloid kind of mode.
Mm-hmm.
It's come down to the microcosm, and it's really interesting. I don't really have an exact point to make about this, other than like, if we start looking at it from that sort of framework, I think we start developing a very different opinion on exactly what's happening.
I think that's why it's important to dissect stuff like this. Like the stream that you were just on, they at one point, I can't remember the name of the channel, Chud Logic, I think, is that what it's
yes,
called?
Chud
Yeah.
Logic.
It was a really interesting stream to listen to. But at one point, the group essentially said, you know, is this even something that we should be talking about? And I went, you should always talk about
Yes,
prevalent
exactly.
social phenomena. Absolutely. If you can see that something is prevalent in a society, so much so that it's being talked about, and like you're actually literally having a stream about it right now, it's that prevalent, then you need to try to dissect it and better understand how it operates so that you can figure
Absolutely.
out how it fits into society and how to better utilize it to benefit society. Not talking about it just allows it to... You remove your ability to potentially have a positive influence on it, or even at least understand how to exist within it.
You cannot make any relevant gains in whatever agenda you're attempting to enact by not engaging.
Yeah.
It's that simple. Like there's no chance. It's not going to happen. And it really sucks, because to have to sort of come at the base argument of, yes, we should actually engage in this thing that the president of the United States mentions. It's a frustrating argument to have, to say the very least, because, you know, whether or not the term itself is actually accurate to what the thing actually is, like what I describe as a very sort of complex set of behaviors that I think is brought on by a kind of market.
But it's
logic.
tacitly understood in the cultural consciousness.
Exactly. People, when somebody says cancel culture, it's like, oh yeah, mobs on Twitter.
Yeah. They know, yeah.
If you start from that place and work away from it with like the assumptions you want to bring to the conversation, that's exactly what you should be doing. And that's, I think, something that like I was being sort of pushed on the idea that I was just engaging with it as like a real thing. And it's like, well, it is a real thing. It's just a real thing that people don't have a full understanding of what it actually entails. And if we don't use the words cancel culture, which was one of the propositions, or if we just don't talk about the thing at all, which is another proposition, like, what are we doing? We're just essentially saying like, all right, well, whatever the president says this thing is, that's what it is. And he basically has full control over that narrative, because he's the person who gets the most attention on the entire planet. He sets the narrative. He said, like, it sucks. I don't like it. I don't think that such an imprecise term happens to be what we know this thing as, but it is what we know this thing as. And I think that it's necessary to engage with it in that way.
Yeah, you shouldn't relinquish your seat at the table of conversation because the person sitting at the head of the table says shit that you don't like, and you don't like the way that they're defining terms.
Well, if you're intending to have some form of impact on the conversation, that's the only thing you can do, is stay in the conversation.
Right.
If you exit, what do you like? Do you think people are going to go like, I think they left this conversation for a good reason. Let me think about it for 6 days.
No, they're going to continue
People
to
don't do that.
perpetuate.
Like, yeah, exactly. The narrative that exists is the one that's going to exist, especially, like I said in the other stream, because the opponent in this particular argument is where institutional power is focused. It's all conglomerated around, you know, very, very rich people who have a very specific agenda. And it's also concentrated in the state in the form of, you know, the billionaire president who is full of nonsense.
Right. Yeah. And those are the people that it's least effective against too, I think. I mean,
Exactly.
they brought, actually, I'll bring this up before I move on, because I do have 78 other things that I want to talk about. But they brought up J.K. Rowling, and I can't remember if it was in the stream or in the chat. And I was like, she could fuck off forever. She does not care that she lost 1 billion Twitter. She doesn't care how many Twitter followers. She is fuck me rich. She does not care. She's not incentivized to acquiesce to your pressure socially.
Nope.
She just isn't. It doesn't work on her. The people that you need it to work on the most And I understand that we think that influencers that are like in our sphere are really important and they're important to our social sphere, and that matters. But the people, like the people in the upper echelon that we really need to utilize these strategies on the most, that we really need to change their minds and get them to sort of acquiesce to understanding better social norms and better understandings of how the cultural should progress, it is not going to work on them, because they do not care whether or not you follow them on Twitter or subscribe to their YouTube channel or follow them on Facebook. It's only the people that are incentivized by that social currency that need you to follow them and understand and watch them and engage with them. It's only the people that need that or who are going to be affected by that strategy. It's not going to change the society. It's going to change the talking heads that you're listening to in your small circle.
Exactly. Yes. And ultimately, like to summarize that whole point, can you cancel Jeff Bezos?
Right.
No, you cannot cancel Jeff Bezos. You can cancel somebody who's maybe a vulnerable member of some community. You can cancel somebody who has a job that they actually give a crap what is said on social media. You can cancel those types of people, but you can't cancel somebody who, I mean, Jeff Bezos doesn't even need a platform. He doesn't need to go anywhere and talk. J.K. Rowling could stop making whatever she's doing nowadays. I think it's making Harry Potter like
I don't know.
things that I don't like. She tweets out things that change the Harry Potter universe slightly. She could stop doing that though, and it wouldn't matter. She can go to an island, sit on a beach, sip
that she owns
beer from a coconut. Yeah, that she owns. And it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter to her in any way. And ultimately, like the people who have power in this world, who are the gatekeepers, who are the lever pullers, none of them are affected by this. And that's why it looks like, oh, cancel culture doesn't do anything. Nobody can actually be canceled. It's because the high profile people, the people who get attention, the people who we're all watching to see if we can get some form of accountability out of, it's not possible to do that with them.
Well, it can be possible, I think. I just don't think it's possible with that specific strategy. I think people see
I agree with you.
I think people see it work on like a lower tier level, I guess. I'm not sure how best to describe it. So that like they see it work, they see it being effective. They see people either being removed from their view or losing their platform, and arguably a lot of the times fucking good. See you later. Like bye.
Yeah, I mean,
bye, Felicia.
To be frank, nobody is spilling tears over Alex Jones not having a platform. It's just
I had a bottle of wine.
From a mechanical purely from a mechanical perspective.
Yeah.
This type of thing should be criticized, because I don't think anybody really sympathizes with Alex Jones.
Right.
Although he's a very funny person. I like laughing at him, but I can do that without him having a YouTube channel, frankly.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And also that taste of power too, I think, I feel like I'm mostly talking about the negatives, and I do think that there are positive aspects to it, because there's so many marginalized people and people who want progressive social change and want really good things and have admirable, honest motivations, that this is their only way to exercise power is, boycotting things and saying, we're going to exercise pressure on you until you understand that you need to be accountable for the things that you say. But one of the problems is that the only people that's ever going to work on are people who already have empathy. If you don't have empathy, it's never going to work. If you don't care, it's never going to be effective. And it may actually, like, look, people like Blair White, she's constantly going on about how she is uncancelable because it just gets her more attention, right? So I struggle with it because I want people to have that power, and I want people to speak truth to power, and I want people to be able to use whatever little power they might have and collectivize in order to, influence society in whatever way that is available to them. And arguably there aren't many. So that's where I struggle. This is where my morality just kind of smashes into it. It's like, I don't know if it's effective. I feel like it needs to be deconstructive, and I've seen people weaponize it for abusive reasons.
Oh, absolutely.
Because they just love being abusers, and now they have the shield of I'm doing this for a good reason.
Yes, there's a lot of that.
So many people do that, but there's honest people who are lost in the mix who are just trying to get people to be accountable for doing shitty things. So, like, what do you do, Peter? Solve the problem for me.
Unfortunately, I don't think I can solve it. I think that it's inherent sort of in the way our society's set up, because again, Justice is even something that is seen as a sort of transactional thing. The punitive justice system is very much, you did this thing, you pay the price. So I think, unfortunately, like, we need to, and this is a lot. This is probably not something I can personally do, but we have to rethink justice. We have to rethink our social relations. We have to rethink our relationships to also, how limited are the targets for this type of thing? Like, in the case of it being positive to remove maybe a harmful person from a space, ultimately, I think to some extent, we are unfortunately talking about only people up to a certain point. Like, once you reach a certain level of success, you're kind of shielded, institutionally speaking, by that success in some ways. Not necessarily all people who have achieved success, but success is, there's different tiers of success. And, yeah, we might be able to get like Peter Coffin sometimes, but we're not going to get Shane Dawson. He benefits from this. He benefits from the attention. It works out for him. I mean, it ultimately becomes a problem of, there's so many systemic factors at play that I think, from the sort of behavioral perspectives, like, there's a lot of behavior that we haven't even bothered to try to understand in these situations. I think that you pointing out that a lot of the time this comes from a seeking of justice, or a feeling that, one is powerless and needs some avenue to express some level of power, even if kind of virtual power in so many terms. I think that those things are very good things to have in mind when we're talking about it. But I also think that along with those conversations, it needs to be said that, like, the people who create these platforms understand that people want the ability to express some form of power on the world around them that they perceive these injustices in. They understand that we have a longing for that sort of a thing, for a just world, for whatever. They don't really care what topic we're talking about. We could even go into fandom and all of that, because they'll manipulate that in exactly the same way. But they set these things up to be sort of engagement traps. Like, the way that these platforms work, social capital is distributed through metrics that you see, whether it be likes, whether it be retweets, sharing things, et cetera, and it ultimately creates an ecosystem in which people do understand that it's possible to benefit from these things. And it's not necessarily that they set out fully with a cynical motive of doing so. I think that this is a factor that will ultimately perpetuate this sort of indefinitely, though, because I think if Jane this week does like a genuine canceling, and it makes Jane into a bigger name, and people notice her more, and people are like, oh, it's so bad what happened to Jane, I'm going to become Jane's patron, or I'm going to support Jane's content, then all of the people who are more comfortable with doing it cynically sort of see like their opportunity. And that, in my opinion, is sort of how the cynical actors get sort of absorbed into this thing. But it's also that I'm not necessarily even blaming the cynical actors here. It's that I'm blaming the setup of engagement at any cost, get more metrics, get more of this, that mode that these corporations build these platforms on, because they're ultimately, I would argue that perhaps it's slightly on purpose, because it manages to keep scrutiny off of the platform. It manages Twitter doesn't really get scrutinized as much as people on Twitter, so to speak. And I think that it also generates profit for them, which, in the form of engagement, which is more or less the proof that the platform works. They present their engagement numbers to investors all the time. And the more people are engaging, the more people are arguing, the more people are shamelessly, obsessively viewing each other's timelines for anything that they can take out of context. That becomes an underlying motivator that, we all live in a situation that is not ideal. We are not the owning class. We are the class of people who is doing things for the owning class. And ultimately, I think that that's really central to the problem, because as long as you do have a genuine concern and they're able to commodify it, then that genuine concern probably will not be solved, because there's a series of institutional points along a specific pattern of events where somebody who has the power benefits.
Right. There's so much to think about.
Sorry,
here.
that was a
Yeah,
lot.
no, it was a
I
lot.
appreciate
And yeah, no, it's a lot to absorb. I'm just thinking about how I first kind of came across the idea to have you here. And it's something that I think merits mentioning, because even me bringing up, why I think people want to do it and have good intentions, and why I understand it, and why I think in some cases it could be beneficial. The thing is that if you shoot, you better hit your target. And people look at the outcomes where, the target was hit and they're like, see, it works. But me finding you was actually, I had no idea. I was not following Better Discourse. I wasn't really aware much about Better Discourse or who was there. I didn't know Milo Yiannopoulos was even still doing anything. And then everyone I followed all of a sudden was tweeting about how you shouldn't go there and talk to him. My feed was full of it. And I thought, oh, Milo Yiannopoulos is going to be a Better Discourse? I wonder who else is going to be a better. And I went and I looked, and I would not have otherwise. It never would have come to the forefront of my mind until people were engaged in the process of trying to make sure that you weren't going. It actually garnered them attention. I went and looked. I didn't know he was there before that. That is a true story. I had no idea.
That's the thing. These types understand that too.
And
they
understand hit that me. Like they gave
they
them
understand
advertising.
Absolutely. I've done a show called I used to do a show called Adversaries, which was primarily about advertising. And we talked about something that I call outrage advertising, which is essentially this. It's outrage bait of some kind.
Yeah. Burning your Nikes and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And a lot of that I think does actually apply here, but these are, the people who understand this stuff and use it in other endeavors, like people who own companies who, market and do like what we would call legitimate marketing. Heavy scare quotes on that, because really you could say a lot about what marketing actually is. Propaganda, but anyways,
it's true by the actual definition. You're absolutely right.
Yes, exactly. But we have like these people definitely set up a system that is ultimately going to self-perpetuate, and when they drop X thing into it and they say like, oh look, this guy's going to do this, they know that the social media people are going to get mad. They know that people are going to get mad that I'm doing a thing. That's why they have me do a thing. So, I mean, I there's no way to actually go compress this into a short thing, but I think that what you're referring to is actually anticipated and it's part of how Milo Yiannopoulos and people that fund Milo Yiannopoulos actually work.
Yeah, they're hoping to engage in that they're going to develop some sort of controversy that's going to cause some sort of fervor on social media that's going to snowball, and other people are going to want to engage in it for either ideological reasons or for real legitimate reasons. Like I can think of 68,000 reasons why no one should ever want to listen to Milo Yiannopoulos ever talk about anything.
No,
ever.
I totally agree with you.
Right.
Like, again, I said that he's a liar. He is a professional liar. That's what he does. He's not concerned about maintaining a consistent position. Even in my research from what I was doing to get him to sort of prepare for that debate, I watched a lot of his censored.tv content, and he doesn't care. Like it doesn't matter to him whether, the situation that we're talking about is pro free market, or like there's a lot of times where he's claimed to be anti free market now, and it's just it doesn't matter to him. And the thing is people think that me going in there is going to suddenly bring a ton of attention to Milo Yiannopoulos and give him this uncritical or non-critical, I guess I can't remember. I can't remember how to say it the other day. I was mentally tired out from that last stream.
You have been running a marathon essentially today. Stream.
But uncritically speaking, just giving him an uncritical like sound off, and that's not what I was going to do, for one, and for two, like I'm gonna go ahead and say that I don't think a lot of people who are watching me are really that interested in anything he has to say. He's not going to say something that suddenly, like, you know, gets a hard materialist to change their mind on, like, you know, BLM or something. I don't know. I feel like it's a little bit different with the audience that I was going in to get exposed to.
That's a good question. Why engage him then?
Why engage?
Yeah. That's a real. Sorry, I'm interrupting you to get you to finish your sentence. You're welcome.
I'm not really interested in debunking Milo Yiannopoulos to my audience. I don't think that my audience puts any credence. I'm interested in going to his audience, or an audience that is at least neutral to him. And I think that that's a generous way of framing that audience. But I'll be generous. I think that it's better to go in front of them and present contradictory information to what they're doing, even if not, maybe it's 5 or 6 of them in the 100 people that are actually in the room that go, oh, well, maybe I could actually see where he's coming from on that. Because it becomes a video. They put the video all over the place and try to get viral moments out of that.
Fair.
If I go in there and say something where Milo Yiannopoulos has no choice but to either agree with me or try to be buddy, chummy, whatever, that ultimately helps me and the political view I am trying to put out there, rather than helps him. Like, if he has to concede things in front of his audience, and frankly a distribution network of an audience that is most likely at least neutral towards him, I ultimately think that helps myself and my politics more so than it helps him. And that's why, I mean, could in theory somebody follow me there and go, oh yeah, all this stuff that you can easily look up and debunk, I agree with it now. Yes. In theory, that could happen. But like, there is a very specific kind of content I make, and it's very oriented towards, you know, what is verifiable, what is, you know, material conditions in the situation. And I think that is something they don't rely on. Now, do I think that emotional rhetoric has no effect? Absolutely not. I attempt to use emotional rhetoric as I'm talking about the things that I'm talking about, but I also back it up with something that, if you look into it, there's something actually real there.
Yeah, okay. That's fair. I'm just going to address the audience for a second because I know we're approaching an hour. I will read super chats shortly, I promise. And if you're not sending one, make sure you @ me with Shannon Q. We will take questions in a little bit. I lost my train of thought. I'm really good at this. So this is why I have a YouTube channel, is because I'm amazing at this. I'm amazing, Peter. So we're never going to be able to cover everything that I wanted to cover. But one of the things right? We could talk for 3 years because there's no resolution to this either. So I'm also, and I think that this plays into it, I'm consciously aware even as I'm talking to you. And it's in the forefront of my consciousness to be absolutely certain that I make it clear that I don't want marginalized people to lose what power they have. And I don't want bad people to have megaphones. I don't want them to have platforms. What I do want is to find the most effective way to engage in effective cultural influence. And when I look at this, particularly in your situation, and I don't agree with everything you say, Peter. I think that I find your channel fascinating. I learn a lot from it, and I find it really interesting. But I don't agree with everything you say. But you and I can engage in good conversation. At least it seemed to be.
I hate it.
Good.
I want to stop this now.
Too bad. You already agreed to it. Your social contract, Peter. But yeah, the point that I'm getting to is, so many like you fear reprisal even now, I think, like engaging in any sort of this public discourse around these complex issues, but it's so important to try to look at them from a nuanced perspective, even though there is that risk. Even though that I may go on Twitter later on, and likely will go on Twitter, read my comments section, and
why would you have Peter Coffin on?
Yeah, or why didn't you hold his feet to the
You're
fire?
legitimizing Peter Coffin.
Do you know what he did?
You had him on your platform,
right? But
except you actually did have me on your platform.
I actually did, yes. But in this instance, it's actually like it's the opposite perspective, though, because your platform's significantly larger than me. So technically, by that logic, you're platforming me right now.
Maybe.
Right? Like if you look at it that way, because that was kind of the logic.
What I'm doing, in my opinion, isn't necessarily platforming, but rather lending some degree of social currency to you. Fair. I think that there is. I mean, not to get into this because this can get very much into the weeds, but to some extent, I'm bringing some social capital to this situation.
Right.
And I wouldn't say that, although my platform does look larger, it's not necessarily a lot larger. I have a lot of dead subscribers from being a bad comedian 10 years ago. So
okay. I didn't realize that you were. It's funny because when you were on the other stream too, I'm a post Gamergate YouTuber. So when people talk about Gamergate, I don't even know what they're talking about. Isn't that funny?
Way. Just keep it that way.
Keep it that way. Okay, I'm fine. I'm fine right where I am. I'm good. I just. Like back to
life
the original,
will be better for you.
Yeah, so far it's fine. Yeah, it's difficult to find the balance between making sure that you're engaging in those concerns and looking to cultivate a better culture and advocating for the right things, and not always, going straight for deplatforming or going straight for canceling, because I think that there's so much nuance, like you said initially, that is in the background, and so many people are incentivized to control the narrative around other people.
Yes.
And because they're looking for the attention that will garner them.
Yes.
That it's so easy to get lost in that and really, target the wrong people, or take a swing and miss and give them and push them into maybe radicalization. I just think better conversations, better dialogue, being able to, kind of have a wave of people in the culture who are looking to honestly engage, as opposed to garner attention for the way they engage.
Yes.
I don't know. There's a lot in there because I think about this quite frequently. We'll take questions soon, guys, I promise. But yeah, so what do you think before we start taking questions?
I think
there's a lot in there, I know.
I had a point, but I ADHD'd out on it. I'm sorry.
Okay. You've been through a lot today, Peter. That's totally fine.
Yes. Oh, that actually reminded me what it was.
Okay.
It was about how. Oh, I lost it again. I'm sorry. I don't mean to do that. I'm
it's
quite
totally
embarrassed
fine.
now.
No, don't be embarrassed. Absolutely don't be embarrassed. One of the things that we advocate here for on my channel is mental health advocacy, and you have been through an incredibly strenuous day, so you absolutely don't need to be embarrassed. I can't talk ever. I engage in just absolute mental articulation. Whatever comes into my head goes directly out of my mouth, and I think out loud. So we all have
how
our
I generally work too.
Fair enough. All right. First, I'll read a couple of super chats that we have, and then please at me if you have questions so I can see them. Everybody on my channel knows that I'm horrible at looking at the chat because I'm usually really busy with the person I'm engaging with. Alan Reyes says, oh, this is just not even about this at all, but it says, in my opinion, as an agnostic myself, I admit that there's a Christian persecution complex. Okay, that can be fair enough. I'm not sure where that fits in. And Brent says, exactly, absolutely, yes, Peter Coffin 2020. So you have Vibrantly Brantley,
so I've got
Peter Coffin
at
2020.
least one vote. I can
you running?
Not win. I could not win. But
you get a write-in ballot.
Yeah, write me in, one person.
If it's in the mail, it may not get there.
Yes.
So,
yes.
That's the funny thing about this. I'm very Canadian. Actually, I don't see anybody adding me with any questions, which is blowing my mind. Because there's almost
They're
always
they're
questions.
all too scared of Peter Coffin.
Are you
They're just
terrifying, Peter?
they've heard all these things about me.
Oh, if only I had realized prior. So maybe I can engage in a couple of more of my
Sure,
questions,
yes,
if that's okay. If you still have
absolutely.
some time, I'm really surprised there aren't any questions actually. Oh, now there's a question. Have either of you been following Chris Hansen and his investigation of Onision and Davi Vanity? I don't know who Davi Vanity is, and I don't follow anything on Onision because then my YouTube feed fills with it, and I can't stand it.
It's a time suck if you get into that stuff.
Yeah.
It's that guy sucks. I'll say that. Like I'm not trying to cancel him or anything, but that guy. I was trying to point stuff out about that guy when I was doing comedy on YouTube a decade ago. Like, uh, you know, maybe it's that I'm not an effective canceller. I don't know.
You're not good at it, Peter.
I'm just not good at canceling people. Maybe that's the whole.
That's why you
my
hate it
whole-
so much, because you can't do
The
it.
whole chip on my shoulder right there is because I'm just not good at it.
Fair enough. Yeah, I've watched an Onision video once because a friend of mine, his name's Jimmy Snow, Mr. Atheist, he was on Chris Hansen's channel. So I watched to talk about Onision. He's a good friend of mine. And
I like Mr. Atheist content.
Oh,
He's very good.
Jimmy's lovely. He's a really good guy. But he was on, so I watched it to support him. And then my YouTube feed immediately the next day was just of 7,000 videos on and I had it kind of carefully cultivated and things that I like, but that algorithm just took over, which I think kind of actually goes towards this. Like people
Yes.
getting in these sort of cancellations. So like that YouTube was like, oh, people like this, and you're one of those people.
Exactly.
You're one of the people who
exactly.
like this thing. And it was like, here's all the stuff about it. And I was like, I don't actually care. And it took ages
Well, and
of me
the
saying, I don't
first
want to see
time
this.
as
I
a
don't want to see this.
YouTuber, the first time as a YouTuber, you notice this, and then you start seeing it happen with other people's stuff. You're like, should I talk about this stuff? Like, is it important?
Right.
The algorithm thinks it's important, then maybe it is important, you know?
That's a hard thing to fight as a creator, I think.
Yes.
It's a really hard thing
And that's
to fight.
the incentives. That's the whole thing I'm talking about. It's not something that I blame these people for making these videos on. Because again, like you start to ask, in my opinion, genuine questions when you start seeing lots of people talking about a thing. Is there something to this? Should I be talking about it? Like I said, a lot of this stuff can come from a very genuine place. It's just that it is subverted almost immediately upon hitting, a mediating platform.
Right, exactly. Like one of the things I thought about when starting this channel was I would only ever have the conversations that I thought would be valuable. I would try to never have a conversation like unless it was, something, drastic that had to do with the community that I was involved in that I wanted to, kind of point out, which I have done in the past that I thought was pretty like dramatic. But I never try to call people to action and attempt to have conversations about what actions mean and not about the people who are engaging in those actions. And I don't know if that makes sense, because then you can create vilification cycles that are incredibly detrimental and encourage people to do that in other scenarios in their lives as well, because they think that that's the virtuous way to engage with trouble. With people that are doing bad things. All right. So Aaron Armstrong says, how do you feel about leftists canceling leftists, such as ContraPoints being canceled because of Buck Angel's sound clip? Buck Angel's a bit of a dick. But yeah, that's a good question.
Yes.
What do you think? I have my own opinions.
Well, I definitely have a lot of, I think the ContraPoints video on canceling is very good, and it helps sort of, I attempted to take an approach that, doesn't, edge in on that territory. I tried to keep it so that there's a good reason to watch both videos, because I think that video does a very large amount in explaining what happens individually between people and between groups during one of these cancelings. I think that it's interesting somebody asks what I think about leftists canceling other leftists, because I think that it's obvious, that it's something that happens a lot. What I think about it is I think that a lot of the leftists are people who should be scrutinizing this stuff from a lens that actually does take into account a lot of the things that I'm saying, the commodification, the sort of systemic effects that come from this type of a thing. And because I think quote unquote leftists often think that they aren't really engaging in this kind of ideology, that they think they might be above it and therefore are not affected by it, and therefore don't like, I'm not what I'm doing here isn't being commodified. I'm doing the good thing. I'm stopping the bad person from doing the bad thing. And I think that I mean, I'm obviously simplifying. That's not how people think, but I think that you often get that sort of it's a situation where they aren't really thinking about like, well, this is something that could be being used to divide and conquer. It's something that could be being used to make money. It could be being used to, any number of things, just to promote a platform or again, to promote something.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really what I think about. What I tend to think more so about like the generalized cancel culture, like seeing, I don't associate it with leftists probably as much as even a lot of leftists do, just because I think that it's kind of part of the market oriented logic / ideology that we're sort of, everything is transactional in our lives. Everything is mediated by some form of platform that often acts as a market.
Often a lot of the people that are acting are anonymous too, so you can't tell
Yes,
what their
very
political
much.
affiliation is or what their motivations or whether or not they're honest.
That's also a very good point. And I think that keeping that in mind, especially to just simply ascribe it to a particular political affiliation, it sort of, it ends up putting a different motive onto the actual actions. It ends up sort of making it more ideological rather than less. And I think that this stuff, it needs to be criticized from a perspective of, what is the ideology telling us? What is being justified in me taking part in this? What's the ultimate point here? If we get rid of this person, what does that do for me? What does that do for my group? What does that do on the platform? And I think that leftists, if I really want to get specific on what I think of leftists, it's that I don't think that they really ask those questions. I think that they sort of participate in this thing that they don't think is ideological because they think that it's bringing some form of accountability, when it is actually part of what I consider to be the overarching system justifying ideology of neoliberalism. I think that it is market logic in social spaces. And I think that leftists could do a little bit more thinking along those lines. That's pretty much my thoughts.
I have something to maybe, I don't know, expound upon or add to that too. I think specifically with, and I'm going to again assume the position of honest actors here. I think with ContraPoints and with a lot of people who are left leaning also, you cultivate an audience that has felt excluded in
Yes.
many other spaces. And they've suddenly found a place where they have a community that is making them feel included and welcome and safe. And if you develop a parasocial relationship with somebody who's making you feel included and welcome and safe, and all of a sudden they expose you to a harm trigger, you can have a feeling of betrayal in that circumstance. You can have a feeling of, I was here because this is one of the only places that I feel safe. Everywhere else I go, I don't feel safe. And I was really like, this was one of the places that I had, and you, the person I trusted to create that space for me, you've now engaged in a behavior that took at least a portion of that space away. Can you please recognize that that's harmful to me because, I trusted you? And parasocial relationships can be kind of dangerous and kind of beneficial that way. But I think that that's a natural reaction to an honest person in that situation, to say, hey, like, that guy's an asshole to people like me. I'm a non-binary trans person. And he talks about us like we're trash, like we're garbage, and we don't exist, right? I mean, so I can understand some of those motivations. Now, that doesn't say that I completely endorse the actions, and I don't say that everybody who engaged in it, certainly not everybody who engaged in it, had those as motivations. But I think at the ground level,
Yes.
those are honest feelings to have. And the problem, and again, I think this is a problem with cancel culture, is that those ground level motivations and those attributions and emotions that are really genuine and very important and should be addressed, they become diluted within this larger groundswell of fuck you, I hate you, you cunt, you should die. And you can't pick out the legitimate criticism from the, entertainment induced rage that you're doing to exert power so you feel powerful or whatever other motivation. Does that make sense?
It absolutely does make sense. I completely agree, especially from the perspective of somebody who's been on the other end of this a lot of times. I have, it's not as though I think that there's never any legitimate criticism against me. I have people who do approach me privately and express, legitimate criticism from time to time. And I think that that's probably the best way to do it, is to approach privately, because publicly it literally just looks like part of the rest of it. Like, it doesn't look like legitimate criticism when it's sandwiched between 5 or 6
people telling you you should have terminal cancer.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But it also speaks, in my opinion, to the real need to talk about it from a perspective of political economy, because all of that genuine, actual, like, I am in a position where I need a space that is safe. I am in a position where I need some form of respite from how things are. That is something that is recognized by the platform holders. They understand that sort of a thing, and they also understand that a disruption in that sort of a thing, that disruption is actually something that can really be good for the platform. And I think that understanding that aspect of it, it can allow us to criticize from the perspective that some form of genuine thing goes in the machine, and
that's a good way to put it.
On the other end, it spits out a commodity, and it starts to look like, hey, I'm demanding this thing and the customer is always right, so you should be doing this thing that I say you should be doing. And on the other end of it, there's, ContraPoints or whoever's being canceled going, I do not know you. I have no idea what your motives or intentions are here. I have no idea what the ultimate goal here is. You might tell me that you have an ultimate goal of, resolving something. That doesn't mean you necessarily do. It just becomes, it's very, very the commodity that comes out is very non-specific. And I think that is, it's really unfortunate, because it does also breed these consumer behaviors where people do have the expectation that the customer is always right, and they do look at ContraPoints as, a vendor of some kind. And I do think that while it's not necessarily the full extent of how they look at these things, that thing factors in, and it ultimately influences their behavior. And I think that that's why some of the more, when you see people label this behavior as like sociopathic or extreme in some way, I think that that's kind of where it's coming from, because there is it can be very easy to perceive it as very transactional, very, I wanted this thing out of you and you didn't deliver it to me. That's not really a healthy way of looking at it, but it is, I think, some element, at very least some element, of how most people are kind of at least conditioned to look at it. And it's not necessarily, like I said, the primary motivator, but it is kind of the attitude that we're sort of told we're supposed to have.
Yeah, and it morphs into this insanely, like, surreal thing that happens. I mean, it's never happened to me in the same level that it would happen to someone like you or someone like a ContraPoints. But I remember the first time I watched someone do like a response video to me, and the imbuing of motives was so prevalent that it was very, very difficult to ignore. And I remember sitting there thinking to myself, I never thought that. That's not why I did that thing. That's not, that's not even the circumstance I was in when it did happen. Why? How could you conceivably know? You've never spoken to me, but you can't really defend against that, because you can't actively. If somebody says, "Well, you did that because this," the only recourse you have is to say, No, I didn't.
Exactly. All you can do is contradict it, and they go, "Of course you would say that."
Right, exactly.
You know, and it's like there's no
They'll
way to win
gaslight you
against
into
it because
oblivion.
exactly.
Yeah, it's crazy. And that's why you lose the legitimate criticism, which is why I don't think it's super effective. Because in the instances where I have deserved criticism, and it's been so hard for me, like it was easier when I barely anybody followed me. And now I've got like, I don't know, 15,000 Twitter followers or something ridiculous, and 20 some thousand YouTube people. Subscribers, that's what you guys are called. Hi. But it's so hard to discern now, because in amongst the legitimate criticism that I want to engage in, like the honest criticism, is 7,000 people who are just trying to troll me to get my attention so that they can make a sound clip or take a tweet out of context and make an entire 9-hour video about something I said to them on Twitter. That's happened.
People will petition you for opinions on stuff too. That's the thing that
just to make a video about you.
Yes, and it's like you'll get people who are like, "What do you think about this thing?" Like I get DMs all the time of like other people's content, people that I don't even know who they are, and they're like, "What do you think of this thing? What is it like?" It's like you do realize that I spent all of my time railing against this mode of operation. Like, I don't know why you sent it to me. Like, you should know by now. Like, if you've paid any attention, so it implies they don't actually pay any attention to me. But that's the thing that it blows my mind. You do have to some extent, have a take on everything. There's a take industrial complex that just like, it's unfortunate, but like that's what's expected. And I think that the canceling it interlocks with that a little bit too, because a cancellation is also kind of a take. So you kind of have to have an opinion on it if you're part of a content ecosystem that's affected by a certain quote unquote cancellation.
Yeah, it's the craziest thing. I'll never forget it. It was the most surreal experience, watching somebody else tell me what I was thinking and why I did something. And up until the day that video came out, I had never heard of them in my life.
Exactly.
Wow. All right. So this is from Zaid Man, and I'm not sure if you and I apparently answer conversations in long form, which I think is wonderful.
I'm a very long-winded person. Like, that's something that people will tell me like up front. They're like, "You really talk a lot."
We'll get along just fine, so long as we take turns. All right. So Peter, do you think it is possible to teach commodification of identity in public schools, or will that only happen in a socialist society looking back?
Whew.
That's a big question.
That's a big question. That involves stuff that I talk about in my book, Custom Reality and You, and the idea of cultivated identity, which is what I call consumer identity. I think that you could, in theory, teach it, but I think you'd also have to have work that was done on it by a more academic-minded person. What I write tends to sound like you could actually call my book a self-help book if you really wanted to, but you really couldn't teach it in a class in a manner, because it's not. I mean, I do cite things, but I didn't cite them particularly rigorously, and I just sort of make assertions that are not necessarily backed up with present information, because a lot of it is criticism of how things work in the present, and if you try to find information that backs you up, you end up finding information that's like, no, the way that this thing works is fine, it's good, just stop, please. So yes, I do think that it could be taught. I think that it kind of is taught, actually. It's marketing class. Like that's how marketing really works now, is they work to sort of get people to adopt various aspects of a thing into their identity. It's a matter of, could you get it taught in a manner where it is negative? If you could say, like, the reason why I reframed consumer identity as cultivated identity, because consumer identity sounds like a thing that just happens, whereas cultivation is a verb. It's a thing that is intentionally done by the marketing. It is working to create identity and take advantage of identity and use identity. And I think that like getting that version of it taught is probably not something that's going to happen, at least at like a for-profit school, and possibly just at any actual school.
Right. Well, I have nothing to contribute because I didn't write a book. Certainly not.
It's actually not the hardest. I did it on my phone at like 2 a.m. every day because I have kids.
Really? I also have a kid, so yes, I can understand the abject lack of time to do anything but maybe drink and sleep. Those are my two favorite things to do. Both while he's sleeping. All right. Well, I am going to give you an opportunity to reintroduce yourself to people and tell everybody who you are and where they can find you in case anybody tuned in late and is not aware. So please, Peter, tell everybody who you are and where they can find you.
My name is Peter Coffin. I am a YouTube video essayist. I make a series called Very Important Documentaries, which you can find at youtube.com/Peter Coffin. I do a podcast called Low Society. It is at lowsociety.net. I wrote a book called Custom Reality and You, which is available on Amazon as both a paperback, an ebook, and an audiobook. If you're interested in that, it's about sort of reality under capitalism, how reality is manipulated, how reality is used. And generally, I talk about cancel culture a lot because I was canceled in 2011. Over having a quote-unquote made-up girlfriend, which was actually me being catfished and it spilling over into the public sphere.
I remember watching that video. We're not going to bring that up now, but yeah. That was one of the first videos of yours I watched, actually.
It's a long thing, and it's hard to get into all the detail about. But suffice to say, it is something that influenced... It's really, if you look at my work, it is about answering the question, why on earth would Gawker, a 100+ million media empire, really care about whether or not some random made up a girlfriend or not?
Yeah, that's a really good question. All right. Well, do you have any final words that you want to say before we sign off about the subject matter, or anything else you want to impart to my amazing audience who I adore and love?
Well, thank you very much for listening to me. There's not a lot of platforms where I just get to go in and have like a normal conversation like this. It's very nice.
Oh, and that's wonderful.
I appreciate you having me on, and I appreciate your audience giving me their time.
Thank you. That's what we do here. So I'm glad that translated well.
It did. Translated very well.
I very much appreciate it. I am very glad to have you here. And because I'm a horrible YouTuber, I'm putting up my end screen. Nobody can see us, but they can still hear us. And I end every single stream by saying goodbye, everyone. And I wave even though they can't see me. And I say, as always, everyone, help elevate the discourse. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.